That ad, the infamous Willie Horton ad, suggests that Dukakis is far more forgiving of criminals than a commander-in-chief ought to be, in contrast to Vice President George Bush. And although its approach is very different, the Willie Horton ad is raising the same question that Peter asked. Because how often should I forgive really is just a nicer way of saying, when may we stop forgiving those who sin against us? And these days, the answers to that question range from never forgive to always forgive, from zero tolerance because some crimes are considered unforgivable to easy community service because boys will be boys. By raising the possibility of forgiving 7 times, Peter is being far more generous than, say, a 3 strikes and you're out policy. But Jesus goes way beyond even Peter's generosity. Peter didn't pick that number 7 at random. 7 is the number of perfect holiness. So to forgive 7 times is to forgive perfectly and completely. But Jesus responds that we should forgive 77 times. Our forgiveness must be beyond perfect, beyond counting. In saying this, Jesus doesn't allow for any circumstance in which we could withhold our forgiveness. And the reason that we cannot withhold our forgiveness is because God forgives us. In one of his more straightforward parables, Jesus suggests that our debt to God is beyond reckoning. Now, an extremely frugal laborer with no family to support might have been able to save a couple of talents over a lifetime of work. Very few people other than the Roman emperor could swing 10,000 talents. And the man with this particular debt was a slave. On the one hand, it's absurd to imagine a king lending that huge sum to one of his slaves. But on the other hand, it's pretty easy to see the allegory here. God gives us our lives, our bodies, our possessions, our money, everything in creation. Even if we could agree on the cost of all that, if it were a loan, the price would be way beyond our means to pay. Without God's forgiveness, all of creation would be a debtor's prison. But with God's forgiveness, we are free to live as we would, as long as we likewise forgive others. The first slave in the parable does not understand this. He pursues a second slave over a much smaller debt. And after the first slave fails to show pity, even when the second pleads for patience, just as the first had, the Lord intervenes and indicates that the first slave was forgiven on the condition that he likewise forgive others. Unless we think that this doesn't apply to us, in the Lord's Prayer, we accept that same condition. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So there we have it. God forgives our sins, every debt we owe to God, as long as we forgive those who sin against us every time, no matter how often it comes up. The answer to Peter's question is there is no number of times after which we may stop forgiving church members who sin against us. But as the Willie Horton ad pointed out, that just doesn't work in real life. Many killers might never kill again, but enough of them do that society is rightly concerned about forgiving them freely. What about those smaller sins that are repeated against the same person. Husbands who keep beating their wives no matter how many times they promise never again. Bosses who keep insulting their subordinates no matter how many times they're asked to stop. Children who keep borrowing their parents' money no matter how many times they fail to repay the debt. Surely Jesus is not asking those wives and employees and parents to keep forgiving and forgiving, only to be hurt yet again and again. So we must ask what it means to forgive. Too often, we think of forgiveness as either forgetting or probation. We either pretend that nothing happened and put it out of our mind without addressing how that sin affected us and how the sinner might hurt others, or we say that we forgive the sinner, but then we hold on to the sin in the back of our mind, bringing it up again when that person does something else wrong. Neither forgetting nor probation really captures the true nature of Christian forgiveness. As we saw in Jesus' parable, forgiveness is more like a pardon. The slave has incurred a debt to his Lord, and the Lord charges him with failure to pay. The slave is convicted both by the Lord's judgment and by his own admission of guilt. And at sentencing, he pleads for mercy. And in response to the plea, his Lord not only releases him, but forgives the debt. That forgiveness does not undo the fact that the slave incurred the debt and was found guilty of failing to repay it. God's forgiveness turns the loan into a gift, thereby excusing the slave from the punishment that he deserves for his failure to pay. Similarly, forgiveness can turn any sin from a debt into a gift, because the person who was sinned against has chosen to no longer expect the sinner to pay punitive consequences. To forgive someone is to let go of any expectation or hope we have of punishing the sinner, which frees us to direct our time and energy to pursuits other than revenge. Like a pardon, forgiveness frees the offender from further consequences of their sin, but does not erase the fact that it happened or the consequences that have already taken place. And thus, forgiving someone does not simply push the reset button on the relationship, returning things to the way they were before. Forgiveness is instead an acknowledgement that although sin has changed the relationship, sin does not invalidate the sinner's humanity. To forgive a person is to love them despite the wrongs they have done to you, not to pretend that those wrongs never happened. And so sometimes that means staying close to a person. As when some friends in college forgave me for being a jerk by remaining friends with me even though I'd hurt them. And over time, they helped me understand that my comments were sinful. But sometimes forgiveness means creating distance. An emotionally abused woman might forgive her husband by divorcing him, letting go of his power over her, and thereby allowing both parties to learn to love themselves. And sometimes forgiveness means isolating a criminal to teach them how to live in love, or naming someone an enemy, knowing that Jesus calls us to pray for and to love our enemies. And so while Jesus tells us to forgive without limit, We may express that forgiveness in different ways. At one time, trying to rebuild a broken relationship, and at another time, deliberately distancing ourselves. Forgiving 77 times releases us both from our assumption that every sinner is another Willie Horton waiting to sin again, and from our belief that we can let go of every sin without changing our relationship with the sinner. Because just as our own relationship with God grows and changes as we sin and are forgiven, so do our relationships with each other evolve over cycles of sin and forgiveness. And for the opportunity to try that, instead of spending our whole lives in debtor's prison, we thank God.